Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today and I hope you all enjoyed these stories. I've just come back from having some kind of throat infection or something, so I'm really glad to be able to record again. And there was quite a few times actually over the last couple of weeks that I really wanted to and I couldn't, so I'm excited to be back. So I hope everybody's doing great today and really enjoys these stories. Let me know what kind of stories are your favourite from this too. I'll speak to you all soon and take care. My family has a hunting cabin in the Algonquin National Forest of Pennsylvania. My grandpa, who worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, became the landowner in the 70s. Whenever the real estate agents used to go into the mills and post ads for huge plots of land that the steel workers would break up and all get their own plots of land for dirt cheap, then help each other build their camps. Allegedly, there was a gravesite found on the property that my grandpa bought. The details aren't exactly clear how this was discovered, but apparently some type of survey was done before the property was sold, and the archaeologists from the University of Pittsburgh uncovered a very old Native American grave. They evacuate the grave, but the pit by that point is now just a depression in the ground, and that's still there. This was on my grandpa's property about 200 yards from the cabin. Of course, I don't know that any of that is true, but the depression was, as far as I know, is still there. And that was the story that we're all told. Of course, when I was a kid, my cousins and I used to do very dumb and disrespectful things, like going to the campsite in the middle of the night and dare each other to lay down on it. I was probably about 10 years old when this happened in the early 90s. My dad swears that he doesn't remember it, but my cousins and I keep in touch, and they clearly remember it. We're all sitting around the campfire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows, talking, just that kind of thing. Obviously there's no alcohol at this point because I was like 10, and my dad didn't drink. I remember my dad shushing everybody and my older cousins, and they're saying that they see something in the woods. My dad's telling everybody to be quiet. He shines a flashlight into the woods. I don't see anybody. We go back to our business as one of my cousins shouts out that there he is again. By shielding the light from the fire, you can see a wispy, greyish, human-like figure walking through the woods slowly, like prowling, like he's trying not to make any noises. He was walking from our left as if he came from behind the cabin and was crossing the wood line along our left and then across the front of the yard along the trees. It was probably 50 yards or so from us, taking a wide turn to avoid us. Nobody said a word. My dad and one of my cousins both shined their flashlights several times, but he would disappear. You could only see him in the dark after your eyes adjusted. At some point, he walked into the field of view where the fire was between us and him, and we never saw him again. The creepy part is the direction that he was walking is towards the gravesite. We had never seen this before or after. I spent a week every summer at that camp until I was about 20, and I never saw it since. Now, I grew up in a very rural area. As a kid, I'd done lots of exploring. Once when I was about 11 and my brothers were 8, we were riding our bikes down an old trail to the edge of our neighbour's property, where he frequented an abandoned dirt road and would go to them often. So we knew that if we kept following the trail, we'd eventually end up back to the main road, about a quarter of a mile from our driveway. We come across an old red iron lean-to. Now there's cow carcasses hanging from the top of the post in various states of decay. That spooked us and we get out as quick as possible. We really didn't speak about it after, but both still explored. Now I also found a house when I was about 16 or so, but never had the courage to go in. It was about 2 miles behind our neighbour's 22-acre property line, I didn't really worry about it because of how far it is, and I didn't want to go too far out on someone else's land like that again. Now here's where it gets weird. At 22, me and two friends got drunk and decided to go exploring. I knew how to get to this house because there's a trail. It's overgrown from years of neglect, but it's still a variable trail. We get to a clearing and there's a house. There's a rusted 50s old pickup from besides the home. It's white wood and still in pretty good condition. The lawn was shorter grass, almost like it was fresh cut, and looked like it needed some weed eater around the truck and house. I didn't think much of it at the time. We didn't plan to go in at first. We walked around the back and saw that there was a whole trailer behind the home. The two were connected by a cruddy made awning and porch. We could see the back door of the house and the front door of the trailer, and they're both open. There's 1/4 glass jars everywhere. I mean dozens, some on the ground under the porch and a lot on the platform. There were so many, they spilled out of the trailer house, and most of them were empty but had a clear liquid. We decided not to enter the trailer because that seemed to be where the majority of the jars are. We were unsure of broken glass and assumed the liquid was moonshine, as it wasn't growing algae like some of the others, so it's probably the alcohol doing so. We go through the back door and find where the house is in disarray. Paper everywhere, tons of water damage. The roof and floors are caving in some places. I found a calendar hanging from 1973. Old toys and books were just scattered. No seating or bedding furniture, but a couple of tables and a desk. The craziest thing I found was a box with that desk. I found pencils, blank papers, and how to write in shorthand books and some records. The records showed a large sum of money being paid not only to local shops but also several people. The place that I grew up in had lots of old money / generationally wealthy people, and I recognised many of the names. Now, one of the names I recognised was my 70-something-year-old landlord's name. The sums of money were anywhere from 50 to 6,000. The large amounts were paid to the school and frequently too. They'd get a check at least once every week, sometimes twice a week, never for less than 1,000. At this point, one of my friends found a plate and glass on the kitchen table. It was dirty, like it had food on it at one point. There were dirty dishes in the sink too. Kind of makes us feel really weird at this point. It had been about 10 years since that day a few weeks ago. Now I'm talking with my dad about 2 in the morning. We were talking about living there for many years and we had many memories. With it being so late, I felt like trying to spook him a bit about the old house. I didn't tell him about the receipts. After hearing the story, he says, "Yeah, that's Mr. Cupp's house. I've heard about this dude for the 20-something years I've lived in that house." The more I got to thinking about it, the more I felt like I remembered the names on the record. I asked my dad how he knows about the house, and apparently, when we were little kids, my parents had too much to drink one night and took some of their friends out to go ghost hunting. He saw pretty much the same thing I did. He told me how he gets to the location, and I realized that the road I found in those carcasses as a kid was on one of Mr. Cupp's driveways. The other came out at about 1/4 of a mile to the opposite side of my house. I then told him about the receipts and our now deceased original landlord's name on it. He tells me he doesn't know about all the receipts, but he does tell me that way back in the 50s, Mr. Cupp and our landlords were at ends about where the property line was. Mr. Cupp had proof on his side of land. The landlord had filed a motion to stall the lawsuit, and eventually, after years of fighting, it was settled that the property that Mr. Cupp was living on is theirs. Some of the details in regard to why Mr. Cupp didn't get the land are fuzzy to my dad, but he does know that landlords didn't tell Mr. Cupp that he had to vacate because they didn't want him to appeal. So for about 10 years he lived there and nobody messed with him. At this point he's in his 70s. The landlord gave Mr. Cupp's property in addition to a lot of property of our neighbour's acreage to her daughter as a wedding present, and they forced Mr. Cupp to pay them in order to stay. The daughter used the money to fund a clubhouse in the middle of the property, and they also redirected access to his road. This went on for some time until the couple who are in possession of the property decide to divorce. This was the brother to my little brother's best friend's dad. His family's home was right down from all of this. He managed to win all the property from the divorce and get the money. The first thing he did was go to Mr. Cupp and sold him not only his property back, but all of the property that was originally the landlord's. So Mr. Cupp closed all of the access to the club and access points furthest to him. He left the one closer to his home open. Then what? I asked my dad. He shrugged and said nothing. He lived longer than died. They found him at the kitchen table a few months after he had died. I don't know who owns the property, nor do I know who maintains it. The only other person in this area with the last name is spelt different now and not originally from the area. I don't actually know much about it else, but I'd never figured out what was in those jars. I think about it sometimes and I have more questions than answers. I do kind of get creeped out a bit by people who live very secluded and have weird things in their house nobody knows about. I guess I'm glad that I found it when he wasn't still there. This is not my story, but my father's of when he was a park ranger. He absolutely loves the job. He describes to me how that you could see some of the most beautiful things in the world out there in nature that you almost become completely blind to when you live in a big city. We do live in a big city now, but we're going to change to live elsewhere soon. Now my father tells me of one experience which really shook him up. Apparently, they kept on finding dolls scattered around. I mean, literally, just randomly there would be these dolls that they would see. They didn't know why it had got there or who put them there, and they seemed to be quite old. In fact, ancient, almost like they were 100 years old. They'd all be dressed exactly the same with a black dress on and short black hair. They always thought it was weird, but didn't know if somebody had left it there, so they just put them under trees. Now, my father had to survey a certain area for something that they were going to build, and he said that he had no problem doing this. Apparently it was such a beautiful day. There was beautiful red-coloured flowers at the ground where he was walking, and the sun was shining very high in the sky. He said he couldn't have felt better. There was a beautiful lake to his left and these gorgeous trees around him. He said, "This is it. This is what made it for me. Moments like this. No one around, but just the trees, breathing in the freshest air that you can and just forgetting about everything." Saying that most of the time that he was in these states, it was almost like meditation, and his mind could wander peacefully through the surroundings around him. He's making his way over to the area that he has to survey, and suddenly, the beautiful scenic nature changes, and a heavy feeling comes over him. He said he can't quite describe it, and he felt abnormally cold. He doesn't normally feel cold when he's out here. He decides to step into the sunlight, and weirdly, he feels the same. He knew something was off now, and he takes a few moments just to scan his horizon and figure out what's going on, but he can't find anything. Thinking this is very bizarre, he stops for even longer now, and takes in a few deep breaths to calm himself when a blood-curdling scream makes his chest reverberate violently. Apparently it took a few seconds for him to come back to normal, and he said that he felt the blood leave his body. He looked around trying to figure out just what on earth this could possibly be, and then he sees it. A doll has been placed on top of, I kid you not, probably almost 100-foot tree. How on earth that got up there, my dad does not know. And the weirdest thing is that it's facing towards him. He then said that immediately he got out of there. He said that he had to jog away for so long that his legs were killing him, and he had to just keep on pounding to get enough adrenaline so he wouldn't feel it. He said that he went to explain it to some of the other guys, and somebody who had also seen the dolls looked pretty concerned and said he would go back to investigate with him. Now they get back to that exact same spot, and what do you know, the doll isn't there. But this isn't where it ends. There's another doll in another tree way too high up for it to possibly have been put there by anyone. They never could explain it. Now my dad also has another similar experience, which was very scary to him too. He said that it was only about a month after this incident happened. Now apparently, all of the dolls eventually just disappeared and they didn't know where they went or why. But apparently when a group of them was still doing some surveying, they heard that scream, the one that my father had before, and again, all of them stopped dead in their tracks. They can tell that it's coming from somewhere towards the water, but none of them want to go. One of them who has binoculars says that you've got to look at this. Tell me exactly what you see. And my dad looks through the binoculars and can't see it at first until my friend guides him there. And they see another doll just floating in the center of the lake. They actually decided to leave the area this time and vowed to not investigate the dolls, and they knew something was off. After this, they didn't have another sighting of one, and they never could solve exactly what it was. Now, for the last story from my father, it's a pretty creepy one. Now, apparently, my dad was training somebody new, and he said to stop up here for a moment, and the other guy threw his bag down. Crash. A really loud metallic sound suddenly reverberates through them. They were both frozen into the spot and can't figure out what it is, and my dad says, "What on earth do you have in that backpack?" They then both look down and suddenly realise that somebody's put a bear trap on the trowel. They were literally only milliseconds away from treading on it, and unfortunately it's got the new guy's bag. Because of the location of it, it could only have possibly been put there intentionally, but who on earth would have put a bear trap on the trowel for somebody to stumble upon? Or maybe they were targeted. They did a good thorough search of the area, but unfortunately could never find anything else. It still haunts my dad to this day, and he's still quite paranoid about where he steps if he's in a new territory. Now, when I was around 15, my friends and I were driving around going to all of the haunted places around the basin. It's getting close to Halloween, so it's a tradition that we try and scare each other. The first place that we go to is called the Haunted Woods. Now, this is actually business. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but not a place in the woods. We go to an abandoned hotel near the UTE reservation. Nothing of significance happened here. We didn't see or hear anything, and we're just goofing around having fun. The driver then says that we're going to Skinwalker Ranch. I've never heard of Skinwalker Ranch, but I've heard of plenty of stories of skinwalkers. I was intrigued at first, but as we drop down the back of the hill behind the property, I get a feeling of absolute dread. It's almost like somebody threw a blanket over us. Everybody in the car got more and more quiet. Like, they were feeling the heaviness too. "I don't think we should go out here," I softly said. "Oh wait, we're going," the driver announces. "There's no moon tonight and no flashlights allowed," he continued. "I'll just stay here in the truck then." "I have a really bad feeling and I don't want to go," I said. "You ain't staying in the truck alone, get out," he said kind of rudely. I get out of the truck and looked over at my best friend. Her face is white and she looks pretty scared. I've not really seen her like this before. I know we shouldn't be here. The driver of the truck said that he was in the back end of the huge ranch. I wouldn't have believed him. that this is really a Skinwalker ranch, but I did feel so unnerved. He walked over to an ancient pole and an old fence. He undid the hinges and we're able to go ahead. He lays it on the ground. There was an overgrown 2-row track leading into the darkness which followed up. The horrible feeling was overwhelming now. I started to think I'm gonna vomit. I wanted to go running back to the truck, but had a deep feeling that something would pounce on me if I leave the safety of the group. We weren't laughing or joking here. The heaviness is weighing in on all of us, and we walk silently through the dark. As we walk, I keep my eyes to the left, but it would occasionally glance over to the side of the track. Each time, I would see a dark mass coming out of the tall grass. I tell myself it's a cow, but each time I look at it, it moves. Finally, the driver and the leader of our foolish expedition stopped and said that we're almost at the old homestead, that we need to stay quiet in case the owners are around. As he turned to start walking again, a growl leapt from the darkness and he stops to take a step back. He wasn't our fearless leader now. His voice shook as he told us that it's time to head back to the truck. We walked away a little to the back, and then one of our group said that they need to use a bathroom. We stopped by a small stream running along the side of the property. I was smoking and talking to one of my friends about how relieved I was that we're leaving, and then glanced down at the stream, and at the same time my friend did, just in time to see a black figure emerge from the water. It's not a cow, not a coyote. It looked too tall and skinny, and like a man. We both scream and run back to the road. This is the last straw for everyone, and we actually run all the way back to the truck. Now I know this is eerie but kind of uneventful, but have no fear, this isn't over yet. A few months later, after this adventure had slowly left my mind, I had started to convince myself that the figures in the darkness are cows, and that it was probably just the dark running water playing tricks on my mind and making me see things emerging that weren't actually real. My best friend had come over to my house to sit outside and smoke cigarettes. We did this pretty frequently. Like I said in the last story, we live in the middle of nowhere, so dumb things like this were about as much fun as we can have. So we're sitting in her car across the road from my home. Her car is pointed towards the town park, which was about a block away from my home. There are no other houses on the way to the park, so with the street lamps on at the park, you can basically see everything up here. "Oh, look, a deer," my friend said suddenly. I could see a set of glowing eyes on the very far end of the park. "Oh yep, there it is," I reply, as we watch and it slowly walks towards the centre of the park. In this spot is a huge metal slide / jungle gym thing, probably about 10 to 12 feet tall. As the deer is walking, I notice that for some reason I can't make out features. It seems to always be out of reach of the street lamps which are dotted throughout the park. The deer is actually right next to the slide when it suddenly stands up. Now the eyes that are watching are suddenly wide. Now this deer is probably 12 feet tall, or at least 10, and it stands on its hind legs. Me and my friend both start panicking. "What's that? It's not a deer," we say as we keep watching this extremely tall creature cross the park when my friends decide that we're driving up there. She locks the doors and we head towards the park. When we're almost there, the eyes had crossed the street and went into the neighbourhood across the park. By the time we get there, whatever it was had vanished. Another few months go by. The event had definitely rattled us and there was no convincing ourselves that it was a deer. Deer do not walk up and they're not that tall. Now one night, I'm at the same friend's house. That friend lives in a smack dab in the middle of a huge farmland. All around her are pastures and it was very peaceful most of the time. We had spent the night watching movies and hanging out. I went out and started my car and we were smoking together on her porch before I go. We were just chatting when suddenly her eyes leave my face and look behind and grow wide. I turn to look and there's 2 glowing red eyes just on the fence next to her neighbour's pasture. What's that? I don't know. The eyes remained fixated on us for about 30 seconds and then turned to the left and vanished. We both ran back into the home. I didn't dare go home for another 45 minutes. If my car wasn't already started, I probably wouldn't have left at all. A couple of years after these events, I was speaking with a Ute tribe member that I worked with, and she said something that gave me goosebumps. It isn't what's on the ranch that you should be afraid of, it's what follows you when you leave. Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a very difficult place to get to. To get to the island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island. You then have to drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed on Rock Island. Even though the island is relatively small, about 975 acres, it had an interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other, and they did have a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part they lived peacefully together on the island. But by the 1640s, the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after the Potawatomi had left the island, some of the settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people on the island. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to talk to one of these new settlers, or even find where they were living. It was around this time that strange things started to happen in the village. Several animals, it's not to mention what they were, but maybe like pigs or chickens, that the villagers keep finding slaughtered, and it seems as though that some of them are drained from blood almost. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burned down. The villagers felt that these things must have been done by the new people on the island, and they intend to get them. But after a thorough search of the island, including the wooded inland area, they never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after, and the search come up empty. In 1836, a lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported that the material of the lighthouse and dwelling are made of the best quality, and the work is done the best it possibly can be. There's also somebody appointed to look after the lighthouse too. Now this is David Corbin. Now, he was there for about 3 years. Now David Corbin started to complain that the plaster started to fall off the building, and some kind of liquid would ooze off through the cracks of the house, leaving it constantly damp. Corbin was completely alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and said sometimes that when he was there, something would come and stare at him, but he would never tell exactly who it was, as they would disappear. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited the lighthouse and determined that while Corbin was fulfilling his duties, he was acting weird. The official report said that the inspector ordered him to have 25 days of absence to find a wife, and to have one to live with him at the lighthouse. However, some think that the inspector was startled by his mental state caused by years of solitude, and thought it would be best for him to have some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery not far from it. The next lighthouse keeper also reported a quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Now, some friends that would actually visit him there say that he would talk of seeing strange things at night, but he wouldn't elaborate on what he had seen. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers are required to have an assistant keeper or family with them there. No strange occurrences were further reported after that, except for strong storms and shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported that he saw two men attempting to row from the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote a terrible storm came up shortly after their departure, and they never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, in May the 3rd, 1876, Betts wrote, "The two men who were completely lost last January have been seen several times, once from the Caney lighthouse and one from the Jackson port. The men were apparently frozen stiff and sitting upright in a boat a mass of ice. At least they were still adrift. There is not much hope that they can be found and buried." By the 1900s, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan, but in 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Saunderson, purchased all of the island, except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. He is responsible for unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still there today. On the south end of the island, he has built a giant stone hall, and it has a boathouse on the lower level. A strong water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed at the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store his immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it's rumoured that some are very rare and are very important, but he died of a heart failure in 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. Now, after his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in his book collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they purchased it for $300,000, which they did. Now, all of the history that I gave is to give a little context for the experiences which I had direct or indirect involvement with on the island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip to Rock Island after taking 2 ferry rides. I arrived on the island at about 2 p.m. I had booked the remote campsite E, which is a backpacking site that's a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking out to the site to enjoy the scenery and took a couple of breaks just due to how heavy my backpack was. I was actually more prepared for camping probably than hiking. I got my site set up and my tent and got everything situated and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so I can make a fire. On my third trip back from the beach, before I get back to my site, I heard a single pitched squeal noise coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that I stop in my tracks and wait for a good 30 seconds, waiting to see if it's going to happen again. It didn't, so I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began starting work on a fire. The remote campsites on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out. Sites C, D, and E are grouped together, but there's probably 100 yards between each site. There's not a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge between the sites that there's an obvious path. As I'm getting more sticks together for my fire ring, something caught my eye and I looked up. Fairly far away, it looked like it might have been at site D, or a little further, was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because, like I said, it's not even really a trail that we're on. Then my mind just went to, there must be something wrong and this person needs help. They get a little closer and it looked like it may be a woman in distress, or maybe something was off who needs help. They got a little bit closer now, and it looked like maybe it was someone in loose grey clothes and a hoodie. It was quite far away though, and I couldn't really make out details. I quickly stood up from the crouching position that I'm in, and just as I do so, I hear a high-pitched squealing noise again. It was behind me now, but much closer. This startled me a lot, so I turned around to look behind me. I scanned the trees for a couple of seconds, but didn't see or hear anything. I turned back around because I knew the person running must be getting close, but now they're gone. Again, I stood there and scanned the trees, but did not see them anywhere. I was so confused, I was kind of froze for a few seconds. It was all very strange, but I was able to reason it out of my head. It's just a fellow camper, right, running from here. I try and forget about it, but it's bothering me. I did not like the squirrel sound whatsoever, and it felt strange. With some effort, I decided to let it go and start my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple of adult beverages and decided to do a walk. I hadn't seen sites C or D yet, so I thought I would check those out and see if I did have some neighbours camping nearby. D is empty. I did see the path that led away from the site and the trail, and it made me feel a little uneasy about the runner. I figured that maybe somebody from Site C took a strange way to get to the trail by going through D. The thing is, it didn't make a lot of sense though, because I probably still should have been able to see them, but it made me feel better. I continued to go to Site C and saw that there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, but I just thought that I would go over with the excuse, and I'm going to introduce myself as a camping neighbour from Site E and see if anybody looked like they might have been the person running earlier. I came up on the campsite and there was a couple sitting on a picnic table. Neither of them appeared like they would have been the person I saw running. I think this is odd, and I introduce myself and they do too. They're probably in their mid-30s and are very nice. They both seem to be pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I did ask about the runner, or the squealing noises, because it was so weird. I wished them a good night and go back to my tent. When I got back, I have a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark and it started as a perfect night. The sky was clear, and just as I was staring up, looking at millions of stars, I feel a bit better just about everything earlier and think, wow, I was being stupid and need to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fall asleep almost immediately. Around 2:30 a.m, I'm awoken though by a huge boom of thunder. It starts pouring down, the wind picked up and the temperature drops. I love camping in the rain, but I did not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through and I start to worry. The wind was whipping at my tent and the ground was shaking from thunder and lightning. I didn't feel good about being out there in a tent and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it became a light drizzle. I just started falling back asleep when I heard the squealing noise again. I opened my eyes up wide in the dark and just laid there silent. There was another louder squeal noise and it was pretty close. I knew there was no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There are deer and porcupines, but nothing like bears or wolves. Knowing that still didn't make me feel better. There was just something about that squeal that I didn't like. I say squeal because that's the best way I can describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. I honestly don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it, an injured or angry pig squeal. I continue to lay in my tent and start to hear footsteps outside of my tent. It was starting to rain, a lot heavier now, and the sounds were a little buried though. It sounded kind of like there was some kind of large animal or human walking around though that I can sense now. I sat up in my tent and took a knife. I feel better with this. In my head I just keep saying, you know, it's just an animal, it's fine. Nothing in the woods can hurt you. I listen as the footsteps start to move away from the tent. I just sat there, trying my best to hold my knife still, for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else now. I start to think to myself, it's fine, it's just an animal. You're being silly. You need to sleep. Now, I was just about to lay back down when there was a very loud squeal which was coming from right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped and a shiver went down my spine. My heart was beating so hard that my entire body is pulsating, and I feel it in my ears. It took everything in me just to stay there. I scream out, "Get out of here," but not shouting, kind of as stern as I can do in that moment. But I don't hear any more squeals or footsteps that night. I also don't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I laid down. Eventually the rain stopped and I just keep laying there until the sun come up. All that time reassuring myself that I was being stupid and it's just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided to get out of the tent to relieve myself. As soon as I stepped outside my tent, I saw that my picnic table had been overturned and is now upside down. When I saw this, I surprisingly calmly thought, okay, that's enough, I'm leaving the island. I checked my surroundings and nothing else seems to be out of place there. I actually reasoned with myself that the wind had blown down the table during the storm. It still seemed a little strange because the table was pretty heavy and I felt like I would have been able to hear the table flipping over. But that might have made sense. I made some instant coffee, had a bit to eat and started to feel better about the whole thing and decided to go for a hike. I admit it, I get easily scared when I'm camping alone, but that's natural. After I had some coffee and food, the sun came out. I realised that nothing I heard or saw was anything that couldn't have been explained, other than not getting a good night's sleep. I was having a pretty good time though. The reason I came to the island in the first place was to hike for 7 miles through Forderson's Loop Trail, because it has lots of interesting things to see, and I was excited to start the hike. I packed a few things in my backpack and head off. Fairly close to the site is a water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked, or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked like somebody had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail was a cemetery and 2 sisters, and there's a few others where people are buried. I believe that it's strange that there are still more buried here in unmarked graves. These very likely are some settlers from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries. There is one by the beach, and that's where Chester Thornton is buried. There's one on the eastern part of the island where the 2 sisters are buried, and there's one in the northern part of the island where the original lightkeeper, David Corbin, is buried. There's also at least one Potawatomi buried on the island, but no one knows exactly where it is. I kept walking the trail until I come upon a very scenic overlook area with a bench where I sat down and drank some water. I start to hear someone talking on the trail ahead of me, but I couldn't see anyone yet. There was a bend in the trail and there were thick trees, so I sit on the bench waiting for these people to come around the bend. The voices were coming closer and closer, and I could tell that they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place the language of which it could have been. Both the voices are very deep and guttural. Then, back in the woods, I hear a loud and quick "oh" sound. Immediately, both of the voices I was listening to respond with their own "oh" sound too. I kind of smiled because it sounded like these 2 heard whatever it was in the woods and were trying to be funny by mocking it to respond. I got off the bench, put my backpack on and started walking in the direction further down the trail where the voices are coming from. But I never found these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where Colburn is buried. I took a self-guided tour of the lighthouse. I passed a wooden gate that was apparently used as part of a larger structure. I walked by the Great Hall and the dock area from where I arrive on the island. I visit some of the other structures on the island, come across the cemetery where Chester Thornton is buried, then finish on the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with a lot to see, and wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to campsite C to ask the couple I spoke with the night before how they did with the storm during the night, but they've gone. I was disappointed because I really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises from the night. Now the rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed since I had so little sleep the night before. I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have been asleep for about 3 hours because when I woke up suddenly, I was immediately fully alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt like something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and this next part is a little hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washes over me. It's unlike anything I've ever felt before. It felt like there was something in the tent with me. I could feel that it's very angry, seething with rage actually, rageful even, and I could feel its hatred towards me. It felt like something very bad was about to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat, and this had just got stronger and stronger to the point that I wanted to throw up, but I can't because I'm frozen. I had never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forward at nothing, just frozen, and the weird thing is that I accept whatever it was about to happen to me. It felt like my brain was telling me that whatever was about to happen, even if it's death, will at least be a relief. Then I passed out. At least I presumed to have passed out. That's all I remembered until I woke up at 8 AM in the morning. When I woke up, I was lying outside in my sleeping bag. On top of it, my legs are in an unnatural position which is uncomfortable. I was on my back with my left leg straight out and my right leg bent so that my foot was up against my knee. The heart started pounding, but I kept telling myself it's a dream. It was a dream. I'm leaving right now. I pack up everything very quickly and start back towards the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until 10:30 AM, I had to kill a little time around the Great Hall and dock area. I wanted to get off the island so bad, but I did feel a little bit better just being out of the woods and I could see other people. I sat down on a bench a little, just to rest on the east side of the dock and lit a cigar, just to give me something to do, trying not to think of the previous night. I was sitting a few minutes and just scanning out onto the water when I was startled by somebody behind me saying hi. I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying, sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you smoking and just come to see if you have a light. I felt silly for being scared and said it's fine. I just didn't sleep well last night and was kind of zoned out, and I handed him my lighter and he thanked me. I lit a cigarette, then handed the lighter back. We then began to talk about the usual things that you might talk about. He said that he's from the Madison area. We talk about the storms we've been having. He seems to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy and talks about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice normal conversation and kind of took my mind off the night before. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. Then, naturally, he says, "Where have you been staying at?" I then tell him that I was staying at Site E for the last 2 nights, and he said that he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said that he booked Site D for the last 2 nights. I was surprised by this because there was no tent or anything at Site D, and the 2 times I walked past it, I told him this, and he said that he comes from the islands a few times each year and that you have to book a site, but he actually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps, and he told me that most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods, south of the lighthouse. He told me that he likes to hike about halfway down from the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods where he finds a place to go. He said that one time he found the ruins of a small log house in the woods, and he's gonna find it again and actually camp inside of it. Inside of it, I thought. At this point, I started to change my opinion about the guy and want to change the subject, but then he asked me if I heard the screeching in the woods. I took a second to reply and knew that he was talking about the squealing I had heard. I told him I did, and he said to me, "Do you know what it is?" This time, he took a second and I saw his face change. He looked at me while I was talking, and almost like he was telling me a secret, with no expressions on his face, said, "A demon lives on the island." Under any other circumstance I would have laughed this off, but not after what I had experienced the night before. He looked at me and must have seen the anxiety and fear I had. He was surprised by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night. I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me like he's trying to figure something out. I felt like he could tell that I had experienced something. At this point, I was ready for the conversation to end. Then he told me that he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now his face and mood kind of changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really did not want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to ask it, so I asked him what he had saw in the cemetery, but my voice was shaky. Then I could tell that he had changed his mind about telling me. He looked at me with empathy and told me, "It's hard to explain, but if I was afraid of the screeching noises, then he didn't think I should go near the cemetery." I didn't say anything right away, but he said 4 words without any context. "Keepers of the flame." I looked at my cigar and the ash was long. I put it out and told him that I was gonna go by the dock for the boat. He nodded and started to walk away. After a few steps he said, "Hey," and I turned around to look at him. He said, "Just don't come back here." I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if that was a warning or a friendly suggestion, but it really felt like it had gone to my heart. I definitely was not coming back to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked up Keepers of the Flame, as it pertained to the Rock Island. I found 3 things that he could be referring to: the name of the Native Americans who lived there, the lighthouse keepers on the island are called this, and there was also a 19th century cult that is said to visit the island and called themselves that. I know hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking the trails, but my humble suggestion is do not go to Rock Island. This was about 5 years ago. Me, my mum and dad were camping at Mary Jane Thurston State Park just outside of Grand Rapids, Ohio. It was around the end of August/beginning of September. Our campsite was in the front part of the campgrounds. Leading up to 2 separate incidents, we occasionally heard what we thought was some kind of birds kind of screaming or screeching up in the trees, or at least that's what it sounded like coming from the top of them. We'd hear it almost every night, but in a different location. We'd hear it in the trees behind us one night, then the next night it would come from the other end of the campgrounds that we're at. I'd listen to the sounds of different animals, including owls, to see if that was the noise, but nothing was ever close. Occasionally, we'd hear what sounded like branches being snapped, but thought nothing of it. I had my own tent, and that detail was somewhat important as it factors into the second incident. Incident 1. My dad woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like somebody rummaging through the ice chest, which was sitting between our tents. He said that he then heard whoever or whatever it was shut the cooler and walk away. He told me and my mum about it the next day. The odd thing is that nothing was missing from the cooler. The second incident happened the night after the first one. I had a small TV and a game console in my tent. I was watching a movie when I hear something approach our campsite. Whatever it is went through the cooler again. I could hear the ice moving around as it was rummaging through the cooler. I was still and quiet as possible, but whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake because it decided to put its massive hand on the side of my tent and push it in. I was frozen with fear, thinking it was a bear maybe, and didn't know what to do. It felt like forever, but was only about 20 seconds before it took its hand away and walked back. I didn't even think about looking for the tracks the next day. We don't have bears in this part of Ohio, so it definitely wasn't. This thing didn't take anything from the ice chest, so despite going through it twice. I know when it put its hand on the tent and pushed it in a little too, because I saw it with my own eyes and it left me terrified with fear. We know it wasn't a homeless person or anyone else because there was maybe 5 sites that didn't actually have anybody in them around us. I don't know what it was. It might have been a Sasquatch or something. Now, this happened during a camp out with my best friend and I about 20 years ago. I have quite a few stories that happened in my 10 plus years of living in this neighborhood, but this was by far my scariest encounter. So I grew up in southern NH and I had some interesting times in East Derry. I grew up in a cul-de-sac with a police captain and detective as my neighbours. I had a lot of weird/strange things happen to me while living there. Most of them are connected to the home itself. I had a type of shadow person. It would take the shape of my family members, and years after moving from that house, my older brothers would tell me that whatever it is likes you. Which brings us to one of our many stories. My best friend lived 5 houses up from me, and her parents owned a pop-up camper. It was located to the side of their porch, which had the door that the family used as a main entrance. Being the young 12 to 14-year-olds that we were, we had many sleepovers in it with other kids in the neighborhood. We had a few experiences, and I'll tell you the most haunting of them. That night, it was just her and I. We're both girls, and at that age, we would bicker over the dumbest things. This night, it was her throwing a piece of gum to me, and it getting lost between one of the mattress linings in the camper. She wasn't willing to give me another piece, which makes us butt heads. We're bickering back and forth about her giving me another piece when we both went dead quiet. All of a sudden, we both heard what sounded like footsteps walking around the camper. Then came the talking. I don't know how to describe it other than it being right there, like a whisper. It still sounds as though it's very distant. It was Mao and we could not make out what it was saying. It's in another language. We look at each other with concern, and I remembered her taking off her socks and just making the 15-foot sprint to the side of the door, up into her room and grabbing the house phone. Her parents were drunk, so we didn't talk to them. Instead, we did the only rational thing and called my house, and my mum ended up driving around the neighborhood 2 times, only to call us and say that she saw nothing. We were freaked out, and we actually slept on the floor next to each other. Where we slept was under the window that overlooked her front yard. I'm not sure when we fell asleep, but we both remembered hearing the sound of raking or digging outside near the trees. Now, this story was about 20 years ago, and to this day I'm still friends with my childhood best friend, and if ever we bring up the story, people doubt it, but I hate that, because I know what happened to me. This happened on the backwards creepy highway road somewhere between Georgia and Florida in the 80s. My family has always been a kind of road trip family since my dad does not like flying. Now when I was a preteen, we took one of the many road trips to Florida and my mum/dad would both drive for the entire 24 hours. We would stop to eat and take breaks/gas. I'd always been a light road sleeper and wake up for anything. The reason why this story sticks with me so well is that it's one of the only times that I've seen both my parents showing signs of being scared, something I never saw before as a kid. So in the middle of the night, I remembered waking up to my parents talking about something in concerned tones. The windows were open since we were far enough south now to be out of the cruddy November Midwest weather. Once I wake up, they both stop talking, so I sit up thinking that they're arguing or something and that it had stopped. I look out the window and see nothing, just trees and fields, the moon and electric poles and woods. But nothing, no houses, cars, nothing. I ask them what was up and my mum says, I don't know. So I'm like, what, are we lost now? And they say nothing. I can hear music, like our radio playing, but it's coming from outside, just loud enough to be a car next to us, but there are no cars on the road. But it's not too loud to make out the exact song, it's just music. And my parents are listening to it too, so quietly. So I say, where's that coming from? And there's a pause and my mum says, I don't know, is it our radio? No. And then suddenly my dad says, just roll up the window. And my mum practically has a heart attack getting the window rolled up. I went back to sleep somehow, but have no idea what's happening, and my dad drives faster. On the same trip, we saw a couple with a trailer hitching up a car behind them, but it was hitched up in a way that it looked like an invisible person was driving. My parents thought it was so hilarious and then redirected any mention of the phantom music to that. Now, I've never forgotten the story, and I can't really make out what it actually was playing that music, but it was extremely weird, especially looking back on it now.